there. I'd like to, in the short time that we have, just relate some of my experiences as a Tuskegee Airman. And I'd like to make a entree, though, as far as how did the Tuskegee Airmen come about. And when I do this, I certainly am not talking to you adults here, and I'm talking about the adults or the people who are over 70. People who are under that as youngsters, and I may have to tell you as to how the Tuskegee Airmen came about. You probably saw last week the news, a tragic incident of this young fellow down in Florida, Trayvon Martin. And, they had a interview with his uncle the other day, and the uncle was saying that Trayvon had aspired to go to school and become a pilot. But he, the uncle said, told Trayvon that there are no black pilots. So it really concerned me because there is this late day and age in the history and story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Evidently, it has missed some spots around. Back in February, I guess it was, during the Super Bowl game, the wife and I were looking at the commercials and the beginning of the game, the introduction to the game. And as usual, we do every year. And we looked and they started introducing the ball players. And they started coming on, they introduced the first ball player. He was a big black fellow. He was about 6'5" and weighed 275 pounds. And I forget what position he played. And then they introduced the next fella, a black fella again, you know, like 6 foot something. And, you know, he was another position in the thing there. And then third fella comes along, a black fella, and they started introducing him. And the fifth fella, a black fella. Then finally another fella comes along, here's this white fella coming along, and the wife said, how did he get in there? That's her irony, her humorous irony, because she remembers the day, and she was really talking to me, reminding us of the day that you wouldn't have seen a black fella in there. Yeah. And they just didn't have blacks on the national big football teams, and even our American sport. Well, the American sport, baseball, there was not even one black in there at the time. Not to say there was television at the time, but of course we saw the newsreels and we read the papers and we listened to the radio. And you know, the same thing went on as far as, you know, I can remember in the neighborhood, as far as I was concerned, I could look around and see the jobs that different people had, and I did see that African Americans or blacks or Negroes or colored, whatever was the identification mark that was given at the time, is that they appeared to be limited because of only one thing, is their color. And then World War II came along. And of course, World War II had a situation where we had what's known as the draft, involuntary service, they called it. So you really had no choice. If you were between the ages, as you probably so well remember, of 18 and 35, and you were able-bodied, you were going to go into service. And the only thing as to when you were going to go in was determined by a lottery. They had your name on a piece of paper. If it got picked out, you're going to go into service. The other thing about that is that you didn't have too much of a choice as to what service you went into, unless you volunteered. And then if you volunteered, you can say, well, I want to go into the Army Air Corps, I want to be a pilot, or I want to go into the Marines or some sort of thing like that. But if you just permitted yourself to be drafted and pulled in, and they said, you're going into the Navy, you're going into the Marine Corps, you're going into the Army. Except for those individuals who wanted to volunteer at the time there. The Air Corps at the time did not accept African Americans as trainees or pilots in the school there. As you probably remember, is that during that time of World War II, we were fighting two world philosophies that were taking place at the time there. One was a Nazi philosophy of the Aryan right and world order and that type of thing, and then the Americans or the Allied side there that talked about democracy and equal opportunity and that type of thing. But you know, somebody was talking a little bit out of the sides of their mouths because you're talking about equal opportunity for whom, and you know, it wasn't for everybody. So what had happened is that a lot of politicians and the newspapers and a lot of civil rights advocates at the time decided to make an issue of this situation and say, well, why don't you follow the feelings of the government and or not the government, but I'm getting a little lost now. Let me tell you a story about senior citizens and senior moments. Okay?
We understand.
I know you do. Right? So just bear with me because it passes. But anyway, there were the advocates of the civil rights and sort of the injustices of the times there. And it was decided at the time, President Roosevelt and Congress at the time, that they were going to direct the Air Corps to admit African Americans as trainees to become aircrew members, which the Air Corps did, but they did it with a restriction, and one that they did it on a segregated basis. So on this segregated basis, those African Americans who wanted to fly and were able-bodied and met the mental requirements at the time there could go in, but they had to accept going in on a segregated basis. The base that was set up was in Tuskegee, Alabama. This was a school that was started by Booker T. Washington sometime around 1895, somewhere around there. But anyway, the government or the Air Corps felt as though this would be the best place to go ahead and train the black aircrew members. And they built a field about 14 miles away from the university or from the college. Anyway, the first class that they had was taken into the service for the training in July of 1941, or not July of 1942. I'm sorry, July of 1941. And it was made up of 13 students, of which 5 completed the course and became pilots. All in all, during World War II, there were 932 pilots who graduated from Tuskegee Army Air Field. Of that number, of that 932, 5 of them were Haitian, and they were repatriated upon their graduation and went back to Haiti. Of the 932 that graduated, 355 of them went overseas. Of that 355 that went overseas, 81 lost their lives. Also within that 355 that went overseas, 35 were taken as prisoners of war. And also of that 355 that went overseas, 7 were evadees. And that's an interesting thing. Evadee is a person who goes down or is in enemy territory and manages to evade the enemy in the hostile territory there. And of course, you can imagine how
that's a hard job.
To evade the enemy. And they were, and some of them did it, and there was one who did it for something like 7 or 8 months, something like that.
Yeah.
His particular situation was that they had partisans or friends of the Allies who he was lucky, or the person was lucky enough to come across, and they harbored that person. But we actually had one guy, though, that was with the Yugoslav, with the partisans there, that actually went out and the forays and raids that they had in the territory there, and he was a drop man. When he was found out to be in Yugoslavia and had gone down and he was well, they were making arrangements to have him brought out of Yugoslavia, and then there was a second thought by the CIA, is that they told him to stay there and that he would be the money bags for the partisans, and they used to pass the money to him to pay out to the partisan greenbacks and that type of thing, so you can encourage as many people as possible to join over with the American or the Allied forces. My personal story is I went into service in 1943, March of 1943, and as Shelley said, I graduated in June of '44 and received my wings, and I went overseas in early of 1945. I got to fly 43 missions into Europe, most of them up into Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Training was quite interesting, and it makes me think of some little things that happened to me while I was in training. Before I went overseas, I had gotten pretty swell-headed as far as my piloting and accomplishments are concerned, but this is pretty normal for fighter pilots. Anyway.
Oh, yeah.
I remember just before going over, I was up flying one day, and a strange or a foreign plane, when I say foreign plane, it was not from our group, but it was the same type of aircraft I was flying, a P-47, came into my territory. Well, we used to, youngsters, you know, and, let me say those pilots at 19 years old like that, you know, these were really expensive toys that we had. And we really enjoyed them. We used to play games with them, and we used to have what we call mock combat, where we would challenge somebody else to go ahead and mock combat. Well, the guns on your fighter plane, they're fixed in the wing there, and actually, in order to shoot at something, you have to aim the plane. You always aim the plane. So when you're fighting another fighter plane, there is you're aiming your plane at that other plane, and of course the other plane is saying, you're not going to shoot me down. He's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to aim his plane at you. So it's like it's like my running through this room, and you're running all through the chairs, saying, I'm chasing you, and you're trying to turn around and chase me. And that's what we're doing with the plane. Well, you're turning, and you're making all sorts of maneuvers and things like that. But getting back to the story, the strange plane comes through my territory, and I challenged it. And this plane took my challenge, and we started in these tight turns to try to get on each other's tail. Before I know it, this plane was on my tail. And you know, once the plane does that, you have to acknowledge that you've been shot down, figuratively shot down. So I rocked my wings and I gave up. And, you know, I said, boy, this person is really good, you know. And I headed back towards the field, and I noticed this person was heading back towards the field also. And then I went into the pattern and started landing, and this person came in the pattern and landed. And I sat down and taxied up to the revetment, and this person taxied up to the revetment. And I got up out of the cockpit, and I took my helmet off, and this person got up out of the cockpit and took their helmet off, and this flaming red hair fell down around her shoulders. I had just gotten my butt beat by a woman. had to tell that story because that kind of cooled me down. Bless those ladies because they were called wasps. And it wasn't a wasp in thinking that was a woman's auxiliary pilot service. And they had a similar number of women like the Tuskegee Airmen, and like the Tuskegee Airmen, who were not too much wanted at the time there because of the prejudice. Prejudice like that was against these women also, and they had a pretty difficult time. The Tuskegee Airmen, as you may not know, about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, received the Congressional Gold Medal from Congress. And I was so pleased to hear that the WASP, these ladies, got the same thing a couple of years.
Were the women African American as well?
No. Absolutely not. But anyway, we got to overseas, and I want to say that we flew as a unique group in that we were all African Americans. However, the irony of it is we're the African Americans, but we're protected from them. I think you all appreciate the injustice as far as the racial prejudice that took place at the time there. And maybe I should go on and just give you some experiences about the flying game itself. And flying a fighter plane, as I had mentioned with one of the gentlemen here, can be a difficult thing for a person who's fairly large. They tried to limit the pilots to 5'10" and 165 pounds. So during those days, you see most of the fighter pilots were pretty small people, because the maximum weight that they would take in the cockpit of the fighter plane was 200 pounds. But by the time you put the parachute on and all of your paraphernalia and everything else, a person my size could easily weigh 200 pounds. But another person asked the question about, how about the personal affairs up in an aircraft there? Personal affairs meaning what, sir? And, well, you know what I mean. And I said, yeah, I think I do. I said, I have given this talk a number of times, and the first time since I talked, this little lady was sitting in the audience, and during the question and answer period, she raised a hand and she says, I'd like to ask you a question later, sir. And I said, fine. And a number of people were asking the questions, and finally this little old lady, she stood in the back there, and I was about to leave, and she came over and I said, oh, yes, you can ask me a question. She says, yes. She said, I just wanted to know, when you're up in the sky there like that, how do you go to the bathroom? That was pretty cute. And, reminded me of, some of the comical things I can think of. Is like, flying on a mission, and I was trying to tell you, 6.5 hours up in the air, sitting in one position, and you can't move. You cannot move to the side. You cannot move forward. You're absolutely strapped in, and you're that way for 6.5 hours. You get really pretty doggone tired. And also drinking that high mineral content Italian water and stuff like that can cause all sorts of physiological things when you're flying on the mission. So, it's like they have a relief tube in the plane there, in the fighter plane. And you're flying at a very high altitude, though. So the air up at the 30,000 feet there is 50 degrees below 0 centigrade. So what happens in a situation like that? Well, water freezes at altitude like that. So, there's a tube, as I said, and this tube runs down out of the plane there. But what happens when the water gets to the outer edge of the plane there, it instantly freezes. So you've got a freezing process taking place back up. So anyway, the cockpit isn't too cold. You know, the cockpit is cold, but it's not 50 below. And as I said, going on those missions, I would get so tired, and you know, I would be aching so much back here. And what would happen is when we leave the bombers, what I would do is I would go ahead and invert the plane, and I would turn it upside down, and I would hang by my seatbelt for maybe just a second. But it was enough to go ahead and take that pressure off of my seat here, you know, and what a relief, you know. And you know, this one day, the combination of these things just didn't work out. You know. There was the water in the tube here, and there was the aching I had, and I turned it upside down, and of course the cockpit just clouded up. So anybody, I guess I want to tell you, anybody who says that fighter pilot flying is glamorous, it's not glamorous. Not glamorous at all. Anyway, I came back from overseas, and coming back from overseas, I was stationed out in Lockbourne, Ohio, and in 1948. And it was around this time of the year, in 1948, just about this time, I had to go on a small maneuver down in Shorefield, South Carolina. And I went down to this maneuver, and the guns on my plane were loaded up. And after the maneuver were over, I was going to come back home on Palm Sunday, I guess it was. And I had taken off, and I had climbed up to around 25,000 feet, and I entered this thunderstorm, which I shouldn't have done. And I lost in the thunderstorm there, and as a result, I bailed out, and when I bailed out, the airstream caught me and flipped me back and hit my leg and broke my leg. And when I pulled the D-ring on the chute collapsed around me with such force that must have rendered me just a little bit unconscious for a while there, because when I came to it, my head was hanging like this, and I couldn't see any parachute or anything, just hanging this way like this, and I started laughing because I couldn't remember why I had one red sock on and one brown sock. But I soon found out. And, but luckily, the leg was broken, but when I landed, the chute bloused over this dead pine tree. And I ended up suspended about 2 feet above the ground. Boy, I tell you, I was really lucky. And I was picked up. I'm in odds places in Kentucky. And I don't know if you folks remember the cartoons Barney Google. Sure. And this was Barney Google territory. And I was picked up by this guy, Leif Daniels. He was like 39 years old, and I think he had 8 kids or something like that. When he took me back on horseback from the mountainside that I was on to his place. His wife was out in the yard, I guess you would call it, with a cauldron, with a fire under it, and she was boiling the water for the clothes there. And she took a look at my leg there, and she went in, and she had some prize linens, I guess it was, or cotton fabrics, but she dressed my leg. He went in, and he brought out this glass, clear glass of what I thought was water. He said, you better take this. What had happened was that, I don't know, I didn't say I was that religious at the time, but anyway, it was Lent, and I had given up all alcohol for Lent. So when I got the odor of this, I told him, no thanks, and I'm in this man's territory, I'm in his backyard, I'm in his country, and he's offering me his moonshine liquor. I'm saying no thanks, and when I did that, he looked at me and he said, you better drink this. So I didn't know whether that was a command or whether it was a suggestion.
Strong
I
suggestion.
took it as a command, and I took it in my hand, and I said, "Dear Lord," I said, "I think you understand. I have no choice." And I drank it, and between that and the morphine that they gave me later on, wow, boy, oh boy, oh boy. But anyway, I guess I wanted to say that is that you can Google this now, is that the plane, of course I'm not in the plane, but the plane crashed 100 yards from Loretta Lynn's house. And just an amusing story is this happened in 1948. About 6 years ago, 5 years ago, I got a call from the town historian of Odds, Kentucky. It's now Van Leer, Kentucky. And he said, "Is this Harry Stewart that bailed out over the town here back in 1948? And I said, "Probably so." He said, "Lieutenant Stewart?" And I said, "Yeah, Lieutenant then." He says, "Well, I've really been looking for you." He says, "I wasn't born until 3 years after your crash. But there are rumors going all around the town here, and I just wanted to see if these rumors were correct and wanted to get the story from your mouth." So I said, "Well, what are these rumors?" He says, "Well, the rumor is that a black man stole a B-52, making a bombing run on the town, and these American fighters went up and shot him down."
So you learned
I wasn't expecting that. I fell off my seat laughing. But irony, 2 years later, here I am down in Odds, Kentucky, among these coal miner Kentuckians, as at their homecoming and as their parade marshal, and being entertained for 5 days by the people down there. So it was really, really gratifying. And then in 1949, that's coming up just about to both the end of my career on active duty, and also the existence of the so-called Tuskegee Airmen. But I'd like to go right back to where I started here and mention that the social atmosphere at the time in the country, I mentioned the football players, and I mentioned the athletics, and I mentioned, you just didn't have or blacks and or African Americans were just not accepted in certain areas there, and the prejudice was really, really oppressive. But one of the justifications that the Army Air Corps used for not taking African Americans as pilot trainees or aircrew members was that a report given by a commission in 1925 of the deportment and qualifications of African American soldiers during World War I. And this was a very, very derogatory report. To paraphrase it, it went on to say that the African American soldier was inept, was cowardly, did not possess the will nor the ability to handle complicated machinery, and therefore they felt as though any future deployment or employment of African American soldiers be limited to labor forces. So now I'm jumping 60-some years, or not 60-some years, but another 40-some years, or 40, 30, 20 years ahead. The commanding general in late 1948 of the United States Air Force, this is United States Air Force at the time, because it was Army Air Corps before 1947, but in 1947 it was made a separate service unto itself called the United States Air Force. Anyway, the commanding general said, you know, I would like all Air Force competition to take place as far as the fighter pilots are concerned, to see who are these really good fighter pilots around here, and let's go ahead and choose, or let the units themselves choose 3 fighter pilots from each of the organizations, from each of the squadrons that exist in the country. And I'd like them to come out to Las Vegas, Nevada, and it was a base out there, Las Vegas Air Force Base at the time. It's now called Nellis Air Force Base. And we'd like to come out there and we'd like to have a real shootout competition. We'd like to have aerial gunnery at 10,000 feet and aerial gunnery at 20,000 feet. The aerial gunnery would be shooting at a sleeve in the air with an aircraft pulling it along around 200 miles an hour. And there's a large sleeve, a little mesh sleeve that you would shoot at in the air. So that's aerial gunnery at 10,000 feet, aerial gunnery at 20,000 feet, dive bombing, skip bombing, paddle gunnery where you're firing at the panel on the ground, and rocketry where you're firing your rockets at a target. The event would take place from May 2nd until May 13th, 1949, and the invitees, at the end of it, the announcement would be made as to the winning team, and that would be the team that amassed the highest score for all of the events, and then for what we call the top gun pilot. Among that winning team, they're the one who scored individually the highest score. Well, the 332nd, or the Tuskegee, what we call the Tuskegee Airmen. And let me go back to Tuskegee Airmen. By the way, that was a term that is a newfound term, Tuskegee Airmen. We were known as the 332nd Fighter Group prior to that time. That term was not brought about until around 1972, and it was done by a fellow by the name of Charles Francis, who wrote a book about the training of the black aircrew members down in Tuskegee, Alabama. And for want of a name, he said, since they're all trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, let's call it Tuskegee Airmen. So consequently, that's how that name has come about, the Tuskegee Airmen. I'd like to also say is that red tails and combat pilots in combat, the tails of the group that I was in was painted red. And they didn't single that color out or single the coloring of the tail or anything else. All throughout the Air Force had visual identifications as far as an aircraft was concerned, so that flying along, you could see another plane, and visually you would be able to tell exactly where that plane was from, what group it was with, and everything else, depending upon the colors and its markings. The 332nd so happened to have a red tail, and that said this is the 332nd Fighter Group, whereas the 325th Fighter Group had the checkerboard tail, and the 31st Fighter Group had the candy stripe, and the 52nd had yellow, and the 332nd. And that had, again, back to the Tuskegee Airmen. I've lost my train of thought again. Anyway, coming back to the fighter gunnery meet in Las Vegas, when all of the scoring was done, is that the Tuskegee Airmen came out to be top winners. There's no moving all this. There's no fabrication or anything. So the thing I liked about it is that it really flew in the face and refuted that 1925 assessment of the performance of the black soldier as being inept and incapable, mentally incapable of handling complicated machinery and that type of thing. And you might say, well, Harry, you're bragging now. You're saying that you're better than anybody else, you know. And I'm not saying that. You may say, well, how did you guys happen to win that? Well, I'll say, no, I don't think we won it because we were black there. I think we won it because we trained
And this can be documented too. We trained harder than anyone else. The training told, that's all. The training was able to tell. So that was it. So then finally, I guess in 1950, I got out of the service and decided that I had so little formal education under my belt that it seemed as though the way the nation was going, it looked like opportunities were going to come out in the civil rights marches and that type of thing, had made the climate such that, you know, it would be good to go out and qualify yourself so you could go ahead and take advantage of some of these offerings out there. So I decided to do the thing that I prize more than anything else that I've done in my life. At least that's going back to school and getting my degree in engineering. And from there, I was right in the assessment of the times and the opportunities that were being, could be had at the time there. I went from there to General Foods Corporation in New York, and then from there to Bechtel Corporation out in San Francisco, and then finally offered the vice presidency of an oil and gas consortium here in Detroit, A&R Pipeline Company. So that was about it, and that's, you know, more or less the story of one Tuskegee Airman, and I'd like to go ahead and open it up to any questions that you might have at this time. France had a vice president, black vice president, and I'm trying to think. The answer is a quick no. Is that I'm still gung-ho American in the field, so we have, if we don't have the finest, is that we certainly have the substance to go ahead and make the finest. And just to put a cap on your question here, 6 months ago, Delta Airlines had a flight going from Hartsfield Airport, that's their base in Atlanta, to Lexington, Kentucky, I believe it was. And the aircraft they were using was a medium-sized aircraft. It was a jet, it was a 2-engine jet. But they were looking for a crew. And what happened is somebody on the crew got ill, and they brought another person in. And this was all done by computer and the names that they had in the computers, that's all. When the crew was finally got together and they're ready to take the plane off, not one, but 2 pilots in the cockpit are black women. Not 1, 2 black women, the pilot and the co-pilot. Not only that, who do you think is in the back there? The stewardess and the other, all black crew and all black soldiers. So, you know, somebody 20 years ago, even less than that, looked and said, you know, is that possible? No way. But this actually happened. Amazing. Yes? Yeah, well, we were in the same, you know, all of the black air crew members trained at the same place down in Tuskegee. And he was down in Tuskegee at the time there. All in all, there were about 3,000 black trainees, but not all of them made it. Only about a third of them made it. That was the 932 that I talked about, which was about on par with the rest of the Air Corps. But Mayor Young, he didn't make it all the way. He got as far as second primary flying, and he did not make it. But he did, from there, become a bombardier navigator. So he still became an air crewman.
In 1944, June, I graduated from high school, drafted in the Army, and my family said, dump out me. And I ended up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to home at Fort Wright. Got off the train, waiting for the bus, and I was thirsty. I walked over to a water fountain, bent over to take a drink, and a man grabbed me by the back of the neck and he says, "Can't you read?" And I looked up and it said colored only. They had a water fountain for white people and a water fountain for black people. And this was 1944.
Oh, yeah.
That was standard. That was standard below the Mason-Dixon line. Yes, sir.
I surmise that you must have been one of the first African Americans in General Mills and in the gas company, in the corporate structure.
Yes.
You didn't want to mention them, you're very modest.
Confirmed.
Confirmed.
A few years ago, there was a movie with Larry Fishburne,
Yes.
and it was kind of similar. And the
Tuskegee
one thing,
Airman,
yeah,
HBO movie.
Yep.
Yep. And the thing that struck me, I don't know if it's valid or not, that it turned out that the bomber pilots really ended up wanting the Tuskegee Airmen as company. Now that was in a movie, so I don't know if that was part of what you remember or different.
Both those movies, I mean, they're wonderful movies, you know, and this last one that you saw there, even though I may have problems with some of the factual things that they show in the movie there, it's inspirational. And the kids can see those movies, especially the black youngsters, and say, gee whiz, you know, my uncle or my great uncle or my grandfather did this, and gee whiz, you know, I can go ahead and do it too. So I thought it was great from that standpoint of being inspirational. Docudramas, I have problems with them, you know. How much is documentation and how much is drama? Usually it's going to be, if you're going to sell the movie, it's going to be 95% drama. Okay, so they have to exaggerate a little bit and that type of thing. Yes, I've never had a bomber pilot say this to me. And it was exaggerated in the movie where in the Lawrence Fishburne movie, they remember at the end, they were going out on this big mission, these B-17s, and one of the guys raised his hand and asked the commanding general or the colonel, he says, "Colonel, would you mind if you assigned the Tuskegee Airmen to be our cover?" And it doesn't work that way. I mean, whether they're Tuskegee or not, they don't fly based on personalities and stuff like that. So it was nice.
Harry, thank you for all the sacrifices you've made.
I have a problem with that, and I appreciate what you say. And the problem I have with it is that I just feel as though I never made any sacrifice at all. I said, I had a damn good time. I enjoyed myself. I loved the flying. I liked what I was doing. And I did it with all sorts of happiness and stuff like that. Those sons of bees that were out there giving me a hard way to go, you know, in town or something like that, I ignored them, and I tried my best to keep away from them, okay? The hardest thing that I found in going down south there was being, what's the word for shamed? Humiliated, okay? Humiliated. And I was sure I did my best to keep away from any situation that's humiliated. They had the campus, which was all black, Tuskegee Institute, prettiest girls that you ever want to see. When I wanted my pleasures and stuff like that, I went straight to the campus, or the other, I stayed on the base there. I stayed away from town, because the only thing that could happen to me in town was I was going to be humiliated, and I refused to go ahead and submit myself to humiliation. So
So you had a good time?
I had a good time.
First of all, thank you for sharing your story. You really are an inspiration. I can't believe you have nothing to say but how wonderful things were, despite any potential for negative feelings. That's incredible. I am not such a, I don't have such strength as you do. I just wanted to ask you, and maybe I'm putting my foot in it by saying this, but do you have anything that you can tell us about the Tuskegee, what is it called, the Tuskegee experiment?
Tuskegee Experiment was one of the things they called the flying school there, because they felt as though this was an experiment that
they would never make it, so it was just an experiment.
No, I mean, the medical experience.
Syphilis.
Oh, the medical
Yes,
experience, okay.
that was like mingle one.
Yeah, Tuskegee, there was a Veterans Administration. They had a
Yes.
Veterans Administration that was aside from the college, and it was aside from the air base that was there. The Veterans Administration was there back in the 30s. Well, they were doing some experiments there. And what had happened was a group that was experimenting as far as syphilis was concerned. And their thought was, what if we don't treat somebody who has syphilis? Why don't we just give them a placebo and not treat them and see what the disease does itself? Will it cure itself, or, you know, that kind of thing.
Right,
So these people were experimenting. It was a terrible thing.
right, yeah.
To experiment on it, but, you know, and, it's similar, you know, it reminds me of similar experiments that they had in Auschwitz.
Right, that's it, yeah. And I read that even after there were cures were available, that they were still doing it. It went until 72. I mean, that's, where, I mean, were you or anyone you knew personally affected by that? No?
Didn't know anything about that.
I'm glad to-
I don't know if it's gonna happen in my lifetime. I wish it did, but I don't believe it. But hopefully in my grandkids' lifetime, this country will become colorblind. And I think that you're being here and you protecting our interests all those years, I think is fantastic.